Is this the beginning of the end of our property boom? Are regulators going to step in and hose down our hot property markets? Are property values really going to fall $200,000 because of mortgage stress, as was in the media just recently? There's some of the questions I'm going to be asking Dr. Andrew Wilson in this week's Property Insider Chat, and we're going to bring some clarity to what's likely to be ahead. But if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in our property markets, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and click the little bell icon so you can be kept up to date every time a new show comes out. I remember a year ago in October 2020 in these regular chats, Dr. Andrew Wilson and I called the beginning of this new stage of our property cycle. But looking back over the first 9 months of this year, our property markets have performed even more strongly than anyone would have ever expected, with the rate of house price growth at levels not seen for a number of decades. In fact, all capital city property markets experienced double-digit growth so far this year, and many locations are going to experience more than 20% price growth over 2021. Of course, it must be remembered that the last peak of our property market was in 2017, and in many locations around Australia, house prices remained stagnant over the ensuing years, and it was really only earlier this year that new high levels were reached. What this means is average price growth has been unexceptional over the long term. But over the last week or two, there seems to be a sudden change in sentiment about our booming housing markets. There seems to be a sense of urgency that's crept into the tone at the helm of our big banks, as the CEO of two of Australia's largest banks have sounded off about the emerging lending risks. Commonwealth Bank CEO Matt Comyn urged our regulators to act sooner rather than later to cool our hot housing markets. And then ANZ Bank CEO Shane Elliott said borrowers were increasingly trying to over-leverage themselves, with sky-high prices threatening to exacerbate wealth inequality. And then the International Monetary Fund even chipped in the last week with a strong warning that surging house prices are impacting affordability and creating real concern for Australia's economic stability. And more recently, Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg suggested that regulators should carefully look at lending standards. Aussie John Simons said that maybe we need macroprudential controls. And then there was the regular property pessimist, the negative Nelly, whose name I won't mention, who got headlines once again saying property values could drop $200,000 because of mortgage stress, and apartment falls could be even more than that. Well, is this the beginning of the end of this property boom? Will our regulators step in and hose down our hot property markets? There's some of the questions I'm going to be asking Australia's leading housing economist, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Michael, and we shouldn't be surprised that, again, these headlines, these predictions, these doomsayer outlooks are rising. You can almost set your watch by it, can't you, Michael? But when we do look deeper, as usual, into the nature of current housing market conditions, then we certainly see there's absolutely no case particularly for intervention from the regulator, which we did have at a previous period in our recent history in terms of the housing market cycles back in 2015 and then again in 2017. And quite clearly that produced more problems than it actually solved. In fact, it didn't solve any problems. And hopefully we don't get a repeat of that. And I think the regulators have learnt their lesson. Let's hope they have.
Well, it's interesting to look back just 18 months ago when the heads of our big banks, they forecast property prices would crash 15, 20, even 30%. And boy, were they wrong. But now it seems like one of those Mexican waves, like at the football the other weekend, where one puts up their hand saying house prices are too high, and then the next one and the next one. Matt Comyn, the head of Commonwealth Bank, who happens to be the nation's biggest lender, he's openly calling for moves to cool the market at a time when you think the bank would actually be doing well because of the loans, and there's actually very little bad debt happening at the moment. What are your thoughts? Because Josh Frydenberg's chipped in. Of course, there's the regular property pessimist we won't even bother mentioning, but everyone seems to have a say.
It's a quick way to get a headline, isn't it, Michael? Proven way of getting your name in the paper, and those doomsayers keep going to the well. And of course, regardless of their lack of credibility in terms of accuracy, the media still likes to run with that. But I think it's now a certain section of the media that pumps up those negative headlines. Perhaps quality media is becoming a little bit more circumspect about the consistency of the erroneous forecasts of these group of people. But I'm a little cynical about banks at one end, Michael. I think that there's no doubt that there's been a little bit of a push from banks to try to get interest rates or even talk interest rates up sooner rather than later. I'm not sure banks are happy with a long-term outlook for interest rates at record low levels. I think they want higher interest rates to be able to improve their margins. We've seen recently a surge in refinancing as a response to a significant marketing campaign projecting higher interest rates, and that obviously touched a nerve with a number of consumers who did rush in to refinance their loans and took out short-term loans. And now we've got the next raft of all that, and from banks saying that they're concerned about high prices. I think what they're looking for is not necessarily mortgage restrictions, but higher interest rates from the Reserve Bank. So I'm a little cynical about that. And really, we have to start asking about the responsibilities, the social responsibilities that banks have, given their elevated position of being just a big four, an oligopoly that develops or that has very strong market power. And I think they've got an obligation not to take advantage and, in my opinion, engage in gouging as a reflection of all that market power. But let's have a look at all these silly headlines regarding overheating housing markets. Yes, we have very strong prices growth at the moment, Michael, as you so rightly said. Even though we will get prices growth over 10% this year in most capital city markets, and some markets, particularly Sydney, may exceed 20%, but we need to watch the COVID outcome to see how that will moderate those results. But it'll certainly be a very big year. But if we do look back to the previous cyclical peak in the middle of 2017 and average prices growth since then, Michael, we can see that prices growth in most capital city markets was around 4% per annum. And that's with record declines in interest rates to record lows. So nothing too exciting about 4% per annum over a 4-year period, Michael. We've got to understand the reason that has averaged out low, and it's given that we have high results at the moment, is that we had significant falls in prices in our housing markets in 2018 and then again in 2020. So we've really been catching up with those falls, particularly from Melbourne and Sydney, over the past year. And that's why we've seen strong prices growth. So therefore, the underlying price growth energy is quite modest and quite rational. And when we look at the market itself, it is self-correcting at the moment. We've seen a halving of monthly house price growth since June in all capital city markets. The trend is clearly downwards. And that's the market self-regulating itself. And that's because affordability barriers from higher prices are starting to squeeze some buyers out. Without higher incomes or lower interest rates, buyers can't keep bidding prices up because the banks will not give them any more money to keep these supercharged markets rising into the stratosphere. So we've seen that adjustment already occurring, and that was prior to COVID, Michael. Now, COVID will impact prices growth because we are seeing lower volumes, lower transactions because of lockdowns. And we will likely get a bit of a surge once we get an easing of those restrictions. And as we did last year, when we do get the market backtracking, when we do get restrictions eased, the market bounces back. But once it then recovers what it's lost, we then move into that sort of self-regulating environment. So in terms of prices growth, it is underlying prices growth is quite modest. And of course, affordability, if that is falling, if this was an issue in the marketplace, and there's a lot of really cheap talk about debt bombs and people being under financial stress, the facts are that mortgage arrears and mortgage defaults are still at very, very low levels. In fact, the Commonwealth Bank has recently announced that its arrears levels are falling. And this, again, is the sense that consumers are becoming more prudent with their financial modelling, given the issues around COVID and the impact of lockdowns on the economy. So there's nothing to support over-borrowing in the marketplace, even though affordability is falling. All it's doing is sidelining buyers. And the other point, Michael, is that a lot of the pent-up demand has been satisfied now. Buyers have bought their properties. You don't buy a property every week. And there's nothing to refuel that pent-up demand now because we don't have the capacity to cut interest rates, which would create demand. And we have virtually no international migration. So we don't have migration to refuel our markets as well. So this is an orderly downward adjustment in our housing cycle. It's come through as a result of a period of roller coaster changes in the market because of the constraints that have been put on the market over the last 4 years. And regulators should actually be breathing a sigh of relief that we are in a position now where those typical forces that do generate that roller coaster cycle are now to one side. And when we look at the issues of sidelining particular buyer groups, first home buyers always come up when we talk about high prices marginalising some parts of the market. Even though we're predictably seeing first home buyer numbers falling, they're falling from near record highs, Michael. In fact, first home buyers have been part of the story of the boom of the last 2 years. We've seen nearly the highest number of first home buyers engaged in the market. We have to go back to 2009 to see similar numbers. And even though numbers are falling as prices rise, the market share for first home buyers still is above long-term average levels. So we don't have any real concerns about first home buyers. The Great Australian Dream is certainly alive and well and has been realised by many, many thousands of first home buyers over the past year. So we can forget about using that as an excuse for intervention. And the usual target for intervention, of course, Michael, are investors. They are an easy target, and they were targeted back in 2015 and again in 2018. And because of the credit squeeze that was placed on investors, we got to the point where we had the lowest number of investors in our history over the past 2 years. So investors have had nothing to do with the recent prices boom. It's been all owner-occupiers. And one of the results of the collapse in investor activity through that credit squeeze placed on them has been a collapse in apartment development, firstly. And we are a country that is undersupplied with housing. And we've seen, when we just didn't need it, a collapse in apartment development. And of course, the other thing is we've run out of rental properties, Michael. And what we're seeing is collapsing vacancy rates, particularly for houses. And rents are going through the roof for houses in most capital city markets. And that's because of a shortage of rental stock. And of course, if we attacked first investors again, as we have previously, that would only exacerbate the conditions of fewer rental properties, putting upward pressure on prices and also constraining development, particularly apartment development. And if it hadn't been for closing our borders to internationals, Michael, this shortage of rental properties would have been even worse. I mean, we're basically missing out on hundreds of thousands of potential homeowners and home renters because of our closed borders. So that would be the absolute worst thing to do, would be to repeat the targeting of investors. And again, the other point is if we start focusing on demand control policies, which never work, they only cause unintended consequences, we're going to restrict economic activity in a period where we need to rebound from the current lockdowns. By restricting what has been a positive period, particularly for state governments' stamp duty collections, it just doesn't make sense at all. And thankfully, most politicians and certainly regulators are quite circumspect about not having the need to interfere again in the marketplace. And let's just really keep our fingers crossed that they do ignore all the gobbledygook that's coming out from the usual suspects again this time, and let the market just adjust itself as it certainly has, and we can, or as it is now, and we can look forward to a much better period in terms of certainty and predictability in our markets. And of course, that's another positive, is that the issues of lockdowns, hopefully, now that we've shifted from that lockdown virus elimination focus to living with the virus and meaning not having to go through these lockdowns again, fingers crossed. So that's my 2 cents worth, Michael. I think we've said this all before.
Nothing new there, Andrew. It's a repeat of a couple of years ago. But Andrew, some people are concerned they don't fully understand the concept of this high debt to income ratio that some home buyers have got. Now, clearly, first home buyers have to chew off as much as they can bite and then chew really hard, and they take on big debts and big loans. But is it really the debt to income that's a concern?
Well, again, thankfully, that seems to have run its course as being the simplistic way of looking at housing market issues and negativity is by comparing house prices with incomes. Of course, incomes have got absolutely nothing to do with house prices. And those that use that comparison have absolutely no idea of what they're talking about in the sense of measuring that as a measure of unaffordability. Because it's interest rates that are the important factor, Michael, in terms of comparing house prices to incomes. It's the proportion of your income that you're paying as your repayment that reflects changes in interest rates. Now, the proportion of income that's being used for the average repayment, Michael, is lower than it's been for decades. And that's because interest rates have fallen. And the reason we're seeing prices growth is because of those falls in interest rates with a given income means that people can afford to pay more or borrow more because interest rates have fallen. So that means they can push prices up, and that's what's occurring. But the banks, to their credit, and the regulators, to their credit, are very watchful that banks do not allow any over-borrowing, that they keep strict lending conditions, which they're doing. And that means that it's all about the level of income growth and the level of interest rates. And as long as they remain steady, then people cannot over-borrow. And that's why we don't see periods, even though we get all this nonsense about debt bombs and mortgage stress, we don't see any correlating evidence in the real data. And the real data is the level of defaults and the level of mortgage arrears. And they are low, low, low. And if anything, they're falling. So I don't know how those that spout the debt bomb mortgage stress mantra, I know why they're doing it, of course, but I don't know how they can justify that position when the official statistics show that it's complete rubbish.
But we know that the banks in their serviceability calculators are already taking into account you've got to be able to service your loan at an interest rate with something with a 5 in front of it rather than what the current rates are. So there is a buffer there. But another big argument recently, Andrew, has been that there's no government authority, no particular regulator that's controlling housing affordability. Now, I'm not sure that there should be, but the Reserve Bank doesn't have a role in setting house prices. Its mandate's to stimulate employment. And at present, that means keeping interest rates low, which in turn, I guess, stimulates our property markets. And at the same time, APRA, its role as a banking regulator is to make sure the banks are operating soundly and there's no deterioration in lending standards. Regulators don't seem to be too concerned about what's going on.
Well, they should be concerned, Michael. They were concerned previously and they caused more problems than they solved. And we're quite clearly seeing, and I don't know, again, those that are arguing there's imbalances in the market can justify that with prices growth now falling rapidly. Not prices aren't falling, but the rate of growth is now declining. And that's what we want to see, an easing in the rate of growth, because we've caught up. We've made up for all those troughs that we've had previously. We've built up, and in an undersupplied environment, which we chronically have in Australia, this just means eventually, of course, we'll continue to have price growth because we have a shortage of housing, but we're not fueling it with the low interest rates that we've had over the past few years and the interruptions to those low interest rate capacities that have meant that we're in this catch-up mode. But we are catching up. That's the point, Michael. We haven't caught up yet, but once we get COVID behind us, we will catch up. And then we'll get a more consistent 4% per year, in my opinion, prices growth, but we won't have to average it over huge declines and huge increases. It'll be just a much more stable 4%, 3%, 5% type environment per year, and that will depend on local factors. I don't understand why, which most credible commentators in this space focus on, and even the IMF acknowledge this, is why we don't start to attack the real problem, and that's the supply side of the equation. We really need to be building more houses, and more houses where people want to live, Michael, and where they want to live, not just a quick surge of fringe new houses as happened through the Home Builder Initiative, which is finished, gone, kaput. We need to have a much more longer term and sustainable policy position for supply. And that's where governments need to get involved. But certainly we need to get a tri-party involvement from local, state, and federal governments on the supply side. It's the only solution, Michael, the only solution. The other thing just causes more demand side policies only cause more problems than they solve. And it's clearly the evidence of history.
Well, it wasn't that long ago that we found out that doesn't work. Let's hope they remember that. Now, other really good news over the last week was that more Australians joined the Millionaire Club as Australian household wealth reached record highs, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The average Australian is getting richer. Now, we know many are suffering, many aren't working the hours that they want to, some have lost their jobs, but overall, total household wealth, and a large part of that, of course, is because Australians own their own home and have shares and superannuation, but household wealth is now at a record high.
Well, again, another tick. It's almost as though we can't believe how good things are. So we need to start looking at why are they so good? They can't be that good. So let's listen to the doomsayers. But it is a very positive environment. We have challenges through COVID. Our economy, I believe, will not have the same issues to confront once we start moving out of lockdown, which is now certainly on the cards sooner rather than later. Moved into the lockdown period in a stronger position, our economy, than where we were when we moved into lockdown last year. It will be tough for many and it will take some time, but at least this time we know that lockdowns are not going to be a part of the future at the level that we've had over the past 18 months. And that's something to celebrate. I think that this is all very positive and it's something that we can, again, celebrate in this country. Despite a lot of negativity internally, we still are head and shoulders in terms of our performance above anybody else, not just in our economy, but also our health performance, which I think is the real key here and that people don't really focus on enough.
Yes. Interestingly, when I talked about Aussies becoming millionaires, what the reports showed was it was net household wealth per capita. In other words, assets minus liabilities. And Credit Suisse suggested there are probably 1.8 million Australians considered millionaires today based on net household wealth. But the good news, Andrew, is that their forecasts suggest the number of Australian millionaires is expected to grow to 3.1 million by 2025, not that long away. In other words, once we get through all this and the economy picks up, life's going to be good, even better.
And in a low inflation environment, Michael, we can look at the nature of real millionaires, and yet we're in a low inflation environment and a low interest rate environment. So does it get any better? Yes, it does, and it will, but we're coming through as usual in a better position than most.
Now, we finished the first month of spring. The first auction results for the spring season have now come in, and it's actually been a very strong month in the two big auction capitals, Melbourne and Sydney, that have been shackled. They've been restricted.
Yeah, well, look, the Sydney market basically hasn't missed a beat. Certainly numbers were well down, no surprise of banning on outdoor auctions. But Sydney doesn't have the auction culture that Melbourne does. Even though 20%, 25% of its property sales are auctioned, they don't have that same strong culture. So they've been probably they've had a better capacity to adapt to online auctions. Auction numbers halved basically through September compared to August. No surprise. But clearance rates really, we've had 8 weekends in a row, Michael, in Sydney with clearance rates above 80%. And the last month, every weekend in September, Michael, Sydney recorded a clearance rate above 85%. So we have to go back to the crazy days of March and April to see anything better than that. So a very, very strong market. A few properties, but whatever properties were put under the hammer, they certainly were sold quite quickly. Even prices growth remained positive with fewer properties being transacted. Melbourne, of course, has a much stronger auction market culture and its auction numbers have fallen and continue to fall because it's come back later into lockdown. But it's certainly providing results that are higher in terms of clearance rates compared to lockdown last year. There'll still be fewer auctions coming through in Melbourne to begin October. But the announcement that Melbourne is now allowing physical inspections of properties, which Sydney has allowed right through lockdown, with some restrictions, but Melbourne has now allowed or changed the blanket restriction on property inspections. And remarkably, Melbourne, we had, Michael, we had a 140% increase in new listings into Melbourne over the past week as those sellers who were sitting on their hands have rushed back into the market. Now they know that buyers can look at their property. So again, these markets will rebound quite quickly, particularly the Melbourne market. Auction numbers will take some while to build up, but certainly private negotiation sales and virtual auction activity will be quite robust now that inspections are allowed And again, it'll be that bounce back from the August trough of the Melbourne market. Other capital cities very strong. Even Canberra, which has been in lockdown, Michael, has had another strong month, but of course from fewer auction numbers. So the auction market gives us that insight. And it really hasn't missed a beat through September, and every market except Melbourne recorded clearance rates over September above 80%.
Interestingly, you mentioned just in passing that properties are selling quickly. I think that's an interesting trend that's occurred. People are making quick decisions. It's an element of FOMO, fear of missing out, yes. But I just think it's a different way we're transacting. We're doing our homework, we're doing our research, we're doing a lot online, and we're just making quick decisions.
Yeah, maybe there's some interesting thoughts to think about how the change or the forced change to a virtual auction environment has maybe changed the process of buying and selling, or the underlying process of buying and selling, how we actually engage that process, how we actually undertake that process. There's no doubt that it's being a fillip for online auctions, I think particularly in Sydney, which was always, as I said, less connected to the outdoor auction. Melbourne's a bit different. Melbourne does have a very strong outdoor auction culture, but it will be interesting to see if that culture changes to some degree and embraces online auctions through what's been a forced environment through lockdown. But it was remarkable, the bounce back in the number of new listings coming into the Melbourne market over the past week, Michael. It was as though they were just waiting for those inspection restrictions to be lifted. And once they were, that was it, off and running. So obviously there's been absolutely no impact on confidence in the housing market in Melbourne as a result, and of course Sydney as a result of lockdowns.
People want to get on with their lives. Now we're 3/4 of the way through this year. Isn't that amazing? October now coming just around in the next couple of days. And we're going to make one of the biggest decisions in our life, Andrew. Did you move the clock forward an hour or back an hour? I never remember at this time of year.
All I know is I always feel sleepy the day after spring back or fall forward, whatever it is, or fall back or spring forward. Whatever it is, I always feel tired the next day, Michael, and probably for the full week afterwards. But anyway, it's nice to have some afternoon sunshine, isn't it?
It will be good. And there's lots of new property news coming out this week, so I look forward to our chat again next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks you, Michael.